I'm so happy to see you all here, and I want to welcome you all to our event commemorating Black History Month. I want to say just a couple of words about Black History Month. Come on in. Historian Dr. Carter G. Woodson launched Black History Week in 1926 to recognize the significant contributions of African Americans, and this was to be held during the second week of February. This was to coincide with the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln on February 12th and Frederick Douglass on February 14th, both of whom played significant roles in the fight against Black enslavement. Dr. Carter Godwin Woodson was an American historian, author, journalist, and founder of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, an organization that still thrives today. And he was one of the first scholars to study the history of the African diaspora in the United States. In 1976, Congress expanded this week to a National Black History Month during the nation's bicentennial celebration. And at that time, then President Gerald Ford urged the country to, quote, seize the opportunity to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every area of endeavor throughout our history, end quote. So today we join with people across the globe to commemorate Black History Month. And it gives me such great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Ashley McGee-Whittle, who is Director of Special Collections and the University Archivist here at UNC Asheville. Ashley Whittle served as Assistant Archivist and Special Collections Assistant from 2019 to 2023. She served as Lead Archivist in 2024, and she was named Head of Special Collections and University Archives in 2025. Prior to this, she worked in the archives at the Biltmore Estate and as the Administrative Assistant in the History Department. She's my student also. She brings a love of regional history and a passion for helping students to the job. Her current research interests, which we will hear about today, include the implementation of convict labor in relation to the building of the Western North Carolina Railroad from Old Fort to Swannanoa. She's a 2016 graduate of the UNC Asheville History Department with a BA in History and a minor in Environmental Studies. She's a 2022 graduate of UNC Greensboro with her master's in Library and Information Sciences, and she teaches as an adjunct for the History Department, so we're so grateful. Come on in, you can take that seat right there. And her classes include Appalachian History, Environmental History of Appalachia, and History of the United States to 1865. So please join me in welcoming Professor Whittle.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As Dr. Judson said, well, she didn't say this, but I'm going to say this. History graduates are taking over the world from UNC Asheville. So my name is Ashley McGee-Whittle. I am the Director of Special Collections and the University Archivist here at UNC Asheville. Today's presentation is about the Western North Carolina Railroad. It includes information on the rail project and its work, archival discoveries at the North Carolina State Archives and the Atlanta History Center, my current research on this material, and for my environmental history folks who are here, which I'm so glad to see, how this relates to what our class is about. So my personal experience with this project is complex. I was born and raised in Old Fort, just on the other side of the mountain. I'm quite obviously an Appalachian historian and archivist. Here at UNC Asheville, I mentored under one of the foremost Appalachian historians and scholars in our time, Dr. Daniel Pierce. I was introduced to this project when he approached me about participating in a project to memorialize the mountain division of the Western North Carolina Railroad from Old Fort to Ridgecrest. The motivation behind that project was the construction of the mountain division of the Western North Carolina Railroad. And it was widely considered one of the most significant engineering achievements of the time. Yet most people are really unaware of the human cost that the railroad exacted. Lots of folks know that the railroad provided the first dependable access to and from much of western North Carolina, as well as much of the state and the nation. Many also know popular names of some of the men who were instrumental in completing this ambitious project. There's names such as Colonel Alexander Boyd Andrews, Old Fort's Andrews Geyser fame, if you know that name. Engineer J.W. Wilson, who was credited with designing the Mountain Division. Certainly Governor Zebulon B. Vance, who pushed through legislation authorizing the railroad. However, what most people are unaware of is that at least 95% of the actual labor that built the railroad across the Blue Ridge Escarpment was completed by inmates from the North Carolina State Penitentiary. And approximately 98% of those inmates were African American men, the majority of whom were unjustly imprisoned. So today I'm going to talk about what has been uncovered in the archives regarding this history, and where do we go from here? As both a historian and an archivist, my job is to help folks find sources for their research, to evaluate those sources to ensure that they're credible and accurate. For a long time now, a lot of Appalachia has been stereotyped and whitewashed. I call it the my contemporary Anglo-Saxon ancestor phenomenon. It's past time to uncover and share the histories of this area, not just the Scots-Irish history. That said, that history is not always pretty, but true history rarely is. However, by uncovering these stories, bringing them to the public through events like this, the hope is to contribute to the journey towards social justice for Appalachia's disenfranchised minorities, to bring these hidden histories and these untold stories to life. So let's get started here. So some of you have probably seen this postcard. It's titled Stripes But No Stars. This image depicts a small fraction of the convicts who were leased by the state to the Railroad Corporation to build the Western North Carolina Railroad. It's a popular image. It's used everywhere. Yale has an online exhibit using it. The Library of Congress has a copy. We have a copy here in our archives in the Fred Kahn postcard collection. The appeal of the image, debatable. It evokes a period in American history that a lot of folks want to forget. A time where racial inequality, the exploitation of minorities was rampant. So as we go through this presentation today, there's a couple of questions I want you to keep in the back of your mind. First thing I want you to ask yourself is, why would we want to forget this history? And the second thing I want you to ask yourself is, who benefits if we forget our history or if it's erased? Who's the beneficiary? So, how in the world did a railroad make it to the frontier of North Carolina in the 1800s? By the mid-1800s, various entrepreneurs, they were looking at Western North Carolina as sort of this untouched paradise, a world-renowned source of raw materials, primarily in the form of timber and minerals. A railroad would provide a reliable way to transport these materials to a larger economy. Up to this point, turnpikes, including the well-known Buncombe Turnpike, were the primary means of resource extraction and personal transportation. For travelers to cross the Blue Ridge Escarpment, it was usually driven by a man from Old Fort named John Pence. That was a daily stagecoach ride from Old Fort to Asheville. If you've driven on I-40, Interstate 40, Old Fort Mountain today, you know it takes about 10 minutes, depends on whether or not you're speeding, to get from the bottom up to the top at Ridgecrest, then another 20 minutes to Asheville. In the 1800s, in that stagecoach that John Pence was driving, that same trip took upwards of 3 hours. So the North Carolina Railroad at this time connected the state from north to south, from Virginia to South Carolina. So it brought the economic benefits down to the eastern part of the state. The western part of the state had been, up to this point, largely ignored by Raleigh politicians, sort of the hillbilly cousin that we don't talk about, kind of like me. However, by 1855, enough people recognized the lucrative opportunity of chartering a railroad, so the North Carolina General Assembly passed the legislation authorizing it. Construction began on tracks running from the eastern part of the state up to the western North Carolina frontier. Unfortunately, for those who were pushing the railroad, by 1864, travel to the area had really come to a halt. the South was deep in the Civil War at this time. Military action was reaching western North Carolina by June. Much of the area's railroad track ended up being destroyed. That was including the track that up to this point ended 5 1/2 miles east of Morganton. This was the case all across the South. Union generals were systematically demolishing most of the South's railroads in an attempt to break the Confederacy's supply chain. Eventually, though, the war ends, and then comes Reconstruction. By 1868, a bond issues passed for new construction to extend the railroad from Morganton across the Blue Ridge and into Asheville. Unfortunately, a pair of crooks enter the picture. Isn't that how it always is when you have an Appalachian historian telling a story? You gotta have some crooks. So in this case, it was native North Carolinian George W. Swepson, he was a banker, and New Yorker, carpetbagger, Milton S. Littlefield, who was a lobbyist, who secured control of the Western North Carolina Railroad by purchasing more than half of the issued bonds. Then they turned around and issued fraudulent bonds to the public. Eventually, the law caught up to them. When the two men received word that they're about to be held accountable for their actions, they skipped town on a train with no lights and $4 million worth of looted bonds. So as a result, the Western North Carolina Railroad was almost bankrupt and defunct before it even got off the ground. So in order to secure the continued construction of the railroad, the General Assembly agreed to purchase it and fund it with state funds. Major James W. Wilson, a former Confederate officer, civil engineer, politician, he's put in charge of the project. It's coined the Mountain Division. It's interesting, though, because most of the politicians, other than Vance, who were agreeing to this and who were eager for this renewed push for the railroad's completion, they had no idea what lay between Old Fort and the top of the Blue Ridge Escarpment. What is that? Well, it's about 1,100 vertical feet. At this time, the idea of a railroad up and over that was an engineering feat of unmatched proportions. How do you ascend that kind of elevation in a steam locomotive in order to get across a mountain pass? The one thing that Wilson knew was that it was going to require a substantial labor force. The problem is where are you going to find that many bodies to throw at this kind of obstacle? We're post-Civil War at this point. A lot of the area's men and boys are still gone. They've been killed during the fighting. There's no labor force in the area. The state's bankrupt during Reconstruction, so there's no money left to pay anyone. So how in the world do you find the labor to build this? Well, that's where convict labor enters the picture. So the precedent for African American convict labor, that had been established long before the first shot rang out at Fort Sumter. What was the precedent? It was slavery. By 1862, railroad promoters all over the South had realized that a labor shortage was delaying railroad construction, including on the Western North Carolina Railroad. So William H. Thomas and Augustus S. Merriman, both from Western North Carolina, wrote to Governor Vance at the time and said, send us enslaved folks from the eastern part of the state to labor on the Western North Carolina Railroad. So initially, these first contracts were drawn up directly with enslavers. However, the number of enslaved people available to work on the railroad was based on that year's agriculture. 1862 turns out to be an outstanding agricultural year in eastern North Carolina, so there just isn't a lot of enslaved people to send up to work on the railroad. However, the main takeaway here is that this form of leasing slaves was created, so the jump to convict leasing isn't far behind. So another way to look at convict labor is to study the development of the South around this time, particularly in North Carolina. The South's economic and political systems devastated by the end of slavery, so by creating a system of convict labor, the South's able to boost its financial viability while also simultaneously laying the ground for white supremacy. Where did all of these convicts come from? Well, also, post-Civil War, quite conveniently, shall we say, the General Assembly passed legislation creating the newly formed state penitentiary system. Who mostly made up the convict population in the newly formed prison system? Former slaves. They were primarily African American freedmen. They had generally ended up in prison due to Jim Crow laws. These were known as black codes and pig laws at the time. Black codes were passed to restrict the rights of formerly enslaved people. Key component of that was to use vagrancy laws. Vagrancy laws criminalized unemployment. Post-emancipation, there's hardly any employment opportunities for a former slave across the South, so black codes made it really easy to pick up any black person who is out in public and put them directly into prison without any kind of due process. Other discriminatory statutes are passed. Pig laws, these criminalize minor offenses such as petty theft. So something like stealing a chicken because you had no job and you're starving, that could buy you 5 to 10 years of convict labor. So these laws lead to this resulting surge in the South's prison population of formerly enslaved African Americans, which meant that the human capital for convict leasing exploded. If there's any data-driven folks in here, in the 1880 National Census, 38% of North Carolina's population was African American. 85% of its state penitentiary population was African American. By 1872, General Assembly had authorized the penitentiary to farm out all prisoners not needed for penitentiary construction for the best terms obtainable. That usually means feed them, clothe them, little else. By 1874, though, the prison system is really struggling financially. So the legislature passes a bill that gives the Penitentiary Board the legal means to enter into lease contracts using convict labor with public works projects. Railroads are classified as public works. So the act meant that every convict over the number 250 would be farmed out for food or clothing, or less if necessary, to any entity investing in the state economy and assisting in lessening the burden on overcrowded, sometimes non-existent penitentiary facilities. Section 12 of this act provides for employing as many convicts as necessary on the Western North Carolina Railroad. So again, most of these convicts, African American men and boys who'd been in prison for crimes that were often related to poverty, the lack of employment opportunities. A few of them were women and girls. They were from all over North Carolina. The majority were from Eastern North Carolina from the state penitentiary system. At any given time, the number of convicts working on the Western North Carolina Railroad was supposed to number 500. They were supplied with food and clothing. Food reports from this time suggest that standard fare is navy beans and cornbread. The railroad spent between 6 and 10 cents per day on each convict's food rations. Total maintenance costs for convicts amounted to about 30 cents per day. That's about $9 today. That sum is entirely inadequate to supply even basic subsistence needs. So disease and death, quite the norm for convict laborers. The convict labor system today is known as having carried forward some of the very worst aspects of slavery. So Major Wilson, the engineer for the Western North Carolina Railroad, he wrote to the governor of North Carolina, Zebulon Vance, pretty regularly during this time. They're friends outside of work. Their wives know each other. Vance was from Western North Carolina. He was a big proponent of having the railroad come to Western North Carolina. He thought it would bring economic benefits to the area. He thought it would increase the value of his own economic interests, including the several properties that he owned here. Wilson complained to Vance quite often about the number of convict leases he had been granted to work on the railroad. He wanted Vance to lean directly on the penitentiary board to send more convicts his way. Vance sided with Wilson. He was a proponent of convict leasing. He'd previously been a supporter of slavery. So to accommodate Wilson, he directed several Superior Court judges across the state to sentence convicts to serve their term directly on the Western North Carolina Railroad, bypassing the state penitentiary altogether. There were newspaper notices that came out, including right here in Asheville, which stated, quote, "The supply of convicts at the penitentiary is not sufficient, and word will be sent out to the prosecuting officers to bring before the courts a larger number of offenders." Today, Vance's actions raise a lot of questions. Ethics, due process, the state's view of equality after the 13th Amendment. And I realize I heard a few of you make noise out here. I realize this is a really serious accusation against Vance and the state of North Carolina that I'm making here. I'm not done with this. We're going to come back to it. I'm not going to leave you hanging with this heavy load without more explanation, I promise, but I want to shift just a little bit. So today convict leasing is called slavery by another name. Why? Well, let's talk about some of the conditions that the laborers on the Western North Carolina Railroad were undergoing. Workers were kept in various stockades between Henry Station, which is just to the west of Old Forts, near where the picnic grounds are now in Swannanoa. Building the railroad tunnels, they had to build a lot of railroad tunnels. This was extremely dangerous. Since the end of the Civil War, black powder had become really scarce in the South. So to excavate solid granite, workers had to cut down these huge piles of pine logs by hand. Then they stacked them, and then they burned them down to produce hot coals. Once they had this big pile of hot coals, they'd pour cold water on it. That caused a sudden contraction that would split rock for tunnel construction. They were also using nitroglycerin. They mixed it with sawdust and cornmeal, and they'd tamp it down into a drill hole. They were not trained to handle these types of explosives. Many of them were severely maimed, hands blown off, legs blown off. A lot of them died. They were buried in countless unmarked graves right alongside the track. By late 1877, almost all convict laborers at the Western North Carolina Railroad site were being transported in from the eastern part of the state. 12 to 16-hour workdays, the geography, the climate, the unvaried diet in the area at this time, this again made disease and death a daily part of their life. So convict camps were called stockades. Prisoners were frequently housed temporarily in train cars. They were usually chained to the interior walls. These were hot and cramped in summertime. They're freezing, they're wet in the winter. Workers were often required to work shackled to one another, what we would call chain gangs. The state also permitted guards and overseers to use whips to beat workers. Their biennial reports corroborate that statement. Conditions were very similar to what enslaved people had just endured a decade or so previously. There's some scattered newspaper reports of workers who tried to escape. Most were shot on sight if they attempted it. Wilson and Vance's own correspondents viewed it as a positive in that it warned others what would happen if they attempted to escape. The stockade near the Swannanoa Tunnel, one of the largest convict camps constructed on the Western North Carolina Railroad. It inspires a folk song, Asheville Junction, Swannanoa Tunnel. It's composed by incarcerated workers, sung as a hammer song while they worked. Hammer songs help provide a steady rhythm to work by. Lyrics often spoke of working conditions, struggles, strength, resistance. Swannanoa Tunnel's lyrics spoke of danger, severe conditions that often led to death. Probably one of the most authentic recordings of the song. There are a lot of recordings too. Bascom Lamar Lunsford, Rhiannon Giddens does a great rendition, but probably the most authentic was done by Will Shorty Love for Duke University folklorist Frank Brown in 1939. He was an African-American employee at Duke. He sang the song unaccompanied while pounding a table to mimic hammer strikes. It's in Duke's archives. You can look it up and listen to it. It's haunting. So let's talk a minute about what it took to get the railroad track up and over the Blue Ridge Escarpment. Remember I said that was 1,100 vertical feet. Building this section of railroad, uncharted territory for any railroad company. So Wilson had to come up with something really innovative, something that had never been done before. He came up with the idea of a twisting, curving track. If you look at it today, it sort of reminds you like a snake or cake layers that ascended the mountain and which loops back on itself to achieve the needed grade of about a 2-foot ascent per every 100 feet of track. So that meant that around 786 vertical feet were overcome in about 7.5 miles. The track's total curvature is roughly 2,700 degrees, or about 8 complete circles, and that was in order to negotiate the mountain's gradient. It was also necessary to cut 6 tunnels. Swannanoa is the longest, 1,832 feet. You have Lick Log at almost 600, High Ridge at almost 500, Bergen at almost 300, Jarrett's at 123, and McElroy at 77. To put all this in perspective though, The actual point-to-point distance up the escarpment is only about 3 miles, but the railroad track is more than twice that. So progress is really difficult. Wilson blames a lack of workers as the primary reason. The legislature actually directs an investigation in 1879 prompted by allegations of mismanagement, but the engineer's report found that most of the delays and the difficulties had been due to landslides. One tunnel caved in during a landslide. It wiped out all signs of human labor at the spot. In another cut, it took almost a year to find a passable solution. Workers had removed 77,000 cubic yards of dirt and rock, but then landslides deposited 110,000 cubic yards of debris back into the cut. It was later named Mud Cut. It's still called Mud Cut. However, by far, the biggest obstacle to completing the railroad, Swannanoa Tunnel. Wilson had to bore through both sides of the gap simultaneously. Now remember, I said that was the longest, 1,800 feet long. That's like 6 football fields stacked back to back to back. So to help with this last obstacle, he brings in the 17-ton Norris-built 440 locomotive, it's called the Salisbury, to haul supplies and laborers to the site. Now how do you suppose they got it to the top of the gap to help build the Swannanoa Tunnel? It was hauled up by 10 oxen and a crew of almost 300 African-American laborers who they hitched to it like mules, and then they drove them with whips. A section of the track was laid. The Salisbury was advanced by hand on the newly laid track. Previously passed sections were pulled up and relayed at the front end of the locomotive. On the other side of the gap, workers slid the train down on a skid by hand. The two crews working on each side of the Swannanoa Tunnel met in the middle March 11th, 1879. Newspapers across the country wrote of the event. Daylight entered Buncombe County today through the Swannanoa Tunnel. That was the phrase that was regularly repeated. What wasn't written about until years later was the cave-in that same day at the western portal of the tunnel that killed 20 workers and a guard. But the consensus, though, was the completion of the railroad was what was important, not the means. So the completion of the Western North Carolina Railroad, it did indeed bring tremendous change to the area. The railroad was later sold. It was primarily due to the remaining cost of extending it to the far western part of the state. The use of convicts continued even after a new railroad president, Colonel Alexander B. Andrews, takes the helm. Like Wilson, he reports various delays due to an insufficient number of convicts, rugged terrain, poor weather as the laborers made their way to the western part of the state. The railroad reaches Murphy, 1891, after passing through Bryson City and Andrews and climbing up and over and crossing Balsam Gap. That becomes the highest railroad pass east of the Rocky Mountains. Andrews goes on to partner with Wilson. In 1885, they build Round Knob Hotel. It's a really popular hotel and restaurant on the Western North Carolina Railroad line just to the west of Old Fort. It becomes really successful. It features a fountain monument. It's later dedicated to Andrews. It's called Andrews Geyser. It becomes synonymous with the railroad. The hotel burns down in 1903. It's rebuilt in the 1930s as the Round Knob Lodge by Southern Railroad as an executive retreat. Most of it is still there today. It's a private residence now. The geyser's still there. It's managed by the town. Helene damaged the water intake pretty badly, and I'm not sure as to the current restoration plan for that. Today, this section of railway is maintained by Norfolk Southern. It's considered a landmark gateway between Old Fort and Asheville. There's a renovated depot in downtown Old Fort that sits directly beside the tracks. Helene, like the hurricanes of 1916, destroyed a lot of the track on the Mountain Division, but Norfolk Southern is rebuilding it as we speak. I ride down Old 70, I call it the Old Way, about once a week to see the progress. There's this big push right now to bring passenger rail service to the line eventually. Amtrak wants to have it operational by 2034. I'll believe it when I see it, but we'll see what happens. So until a few years ago, the name most associated with this section of railroad, Colonel Andrews. He's often featured as the key player in the building of the Mountain Division. That changed in 2020 though. Now retired UNC Asheville history professor Dr. Daniel Pierce, Marion's mayor Steve Little got together on Dan's front porch during COVID. They decided to organize the nonprofit organization, the Rail Project, to honor these incarcerated laborers who endured the brutal conditions that it took to build the railroad up and over the Blue Ridge Escarpment. Board members for this organization. We have a whole mix of backgrounds. We've got historians, we've got archivists, we've got a local stonemason. At this point, we've placed 3 memorials to these workers. The first to Andrews Geyser near Round Knob. The second's a wayside panel at the head of Old 70, just over the Swannanoa Tunnel. The third is a boulder at a presumed stockade in Ridgecrest. To add the information and the worker names to the memorials, we spent hundreds of hours scouring newspapers.com, ancestry.com, the census. We searched for terms like convict and Western North Carolina Railroad. Okay, you've made it this far. Guess what? Here's where the story really starts. So in 2023, one of my colleagues from Warren Wilson, Dr. Jeff Keith, he's a music historian. He was down at the North Carolina State Archives. He was researching the Swannanoa Tunnel song. So the archivist comes out from the back, hands him some folders from a box, and he says, well, I want to look through the rest of the box. She's like, you can't look through it, it's restricted. So he's like, what's in the box that I can't see? Well, it turns out that what was in the box was the actual penal records of the laborers that worked directly on the railroad. So Jeff reaches out to Dr. Darren Waters. He's another rail board member. He's now the Deputy Secretary for the Office of Archives and History. He's also a former history professor here at UNC Asheville. And then Darren contacts the state archivist at the time. Her name was Sarah Kuntz and her team. He says, hey, I got a colleague who's down at the state archives. He wants to see these restricted prison records. This is from over 100 years ago. How do we get these open? So Sarah says, you and Darren and Dan should reach out to your local representative. That happened to be John Ager at the time. John includes a provision in a larger omnibus bill that's presented to the state legislature in order to release those records. And it passed. I know you see the Atlanta History Center on this slide too. I'm getting there. Just hold on to your horses. There's more. Wait, there's more. So these records at the state archives that were open for the first time, they included first and last names, ages, race, where they were from, what they'd been convicted for, how many years they served, when they were sent to the Western North Carolina Railroad, their disposition. Did they die? Were they released? Were they exonerated? When these records were opened, Dr. Keith and his colleague, then myself a couple of weeks later, were the first 3 people to see them, ever. Another of my colleagues in Raleigh, I always butcher her name, Kayla Kolklasher, she's an anthropology PhD candidate. She was there the day after me. We run into each other. She was coming to access the records too. She has created this fantastic site for the state archives. It showcases some of these items. Her particular focus is on laborers' resistance during their incarceration. So anyway, the day I was there, I probably looked through 1,000 pages of penitentiary board notes. These notes described working in penitentiary conditions, day-to-day supervision of convicts. I mean, it was just absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, every 2 minutes I was texting Dan Pierce or my husband saying, you're never going to believe what I found. I've got hundreds and hundreds of scans, maybe close to 1,000, so many that I'm still actually going through them. Here's another kicker. After I left, months after I left, they found more records down there that they hadn't pulled out when I was down there for my appointment. So, as you can guess, I'm going to have to go back to Raleigh at some point soon. Sorry to my husband, Ben. So, at the same time all of this was going on, very same time, I found out by chance that the Atlanta History Center was opening a railroad collection to the public. Imagine my surprise when I find out that it's Southern Railway's archives. So in 2021, Norfolk Southern Railway donated the entire archival holdings of their predecessor, Southern Railway, to the Atlanta History Center. Southern Railway is who helped charter and oversee the construction of the Mountain Division of the Western North Carolina Railroad. That's who Wilson represented. So those records go from 1828 to 2007. They were cataloged or processed, as we archivists call it, over 2.5 years. They were open for research at the beginning of 2024. So one weekend that summer, I was about an hour north of Atlanta with the husband, and as of today, my now 5-year-old daughter, she's turned 5 today, we were visiting his parents, my in-laws who are here too, and I thought, you know, I'm going to take the day, leave the kid with the husband, I'm going to go down to Atlanta, I'm going to go check these records out and see what might be there. Might not be nothing. Oh dear God, I almost had a stroke when I got down there and got sat down with the stuff. I realized real quick, this was the side of the story from Wilson and the Railroad Board, and that most all of these documents matched up and cross-referenced with the State Penitentiary Board notes. So I'm going to put this in as an aside. I wish Dr. Pearson was here. This whole project just demands some kind of digital humanities mapping component. There's something coming down the pike with that, though, between me and the digital arm of the State Archives. Can't say what just yet because we're in the planning stages. Anyway, so these records included labor conditions, weather, geographical issues, topography notes, stockade builds, costs, purchases, notes on Wilson's letters to Vance requesting more convicts to complete the line. One of the more memorable documents I found was the Railroad Board's report and Wilson's petition to put the convicts in the state penitentiary sent overseers under strict military law because Wilson didn't feel like the convicts were working with enough discipline and urgency. So the response back from the Penitentiary Board was real facetious. They told Wilson and the Railroad Board, if you want a military, you better get yourself, quote, a spirit-stirring drum and drummer, an ear-piercing pipe and piper for each of the quarters Round Knob, Long Branch, and Lick Log. They were basically telling Wilson, we don't have money for something like that. Stop bothering us. Send us our lease fees and zip it. So make no mistake, these records are not just about the story between the state penitentiary and the Railroad Board, although that is a major facet of it as well. The real story, though, is that without the disenfranchised black bodies that built this railroad, which these records fully document, the progress that came to Western North Carolina in the form of timber profits, the healthcare boom, the economic benefits derived from regional tourism, none of that would have been possible. So taking these records and combining them with what I have found on newspapers.com, I have the evidence to show that North Carolina's state legislature passed legislation explicitly directing Superior Court judges across the state to send African Americans directly to the Western North Carolina Railroad on exaggerated charges with overdone sentences, bypassing the state penitentiary and effectively sending them to death. All in the name of economic progress and by transforming what was previously slave labor into a legal form of slave labor known as convict leasing. So these records, which were not open to the public for well over a century, they illustrate that the state of North Carolina was unequivocally complicit in supplying the Western North Carolina railroad with African Americans who were almost always improperly incarcerated. Equally damning, supporting this tandem arrangement with Wilson and directing the state legislature to pass these laws was none other than Western North Carolina's own Zebulon B. Vance, who just happened to be governor at the time. So what does all this mean? I mean, what does it really mean? Why does it matter? Why is it important? That's more than 100 years. Everyone asks me that question. For my students who are here today from my environmental history class, what we have discussed today is important because Appalachian environmental history is defined by a debt labor regime, where extractive capitalism linked the destruction of the landscape to the systemic exploitation of labor. This relationship relied on stripping the region's natural resources, coal, timber, while trapping workers in cycles of unfree or coerced labor to maximize profit for outside interests. The history of this railroad epitomizes that system. So academically, for me, it's my current area of research, has been for a few years now. Got a couple pieces I'm working on for publications. One's in editing stages with the Writing Center here. Plug for the Writing Center. I go there, you should too. And it's about to be submitted to the North Carolina Historical Review for publication this fall. If they take it, fingers crossed. I'm presenting this at the Appalachian Studies Association conference next month. I've presented for the State Archives a couple of times. I presented for North Carolina Community College Archives Association, which is all great, you know, and a load of bull. But personally, it means a whole lot more to me. One thing I didn't say in my introduction, my grandfather, my mom's father, retired from Norfolk Southern after 30 years as a conductor. He passed away in 2013. He was a member of several unions, including the United Transportation Union, so I come from a Norfolk Southern family. However, this is also the same man whose great-grandmother was a formerly enslaved African-American woman who was married to a white man 4 decades her senior, and who lived right here in Western North Carolina on a working tobacco farm of more than 600 acres. So there's a lot of personal significance in this project tied up for me. In the interest of time, it's a really complicated history. The big picture remains the same. This material needs to be shared. I have highlighted several of my colleagues' works on this material in this presentation because it needs to be disseminated. The image on this slide right here, this is the website that my Raleigh colleague, Kayla, put together for the State Archives. This is a great website. I would highly recommend that you take a look at it. Your next question is, why does this information need to be widely shared? I guess what I'm going to tell you. So many people do not know and understand their own history. For many of those who live here in Western North Carolina, that holds true as well. I did not know this story until the rail project started. I knew about Andrews Geyser, Colonel Andrews. I never thought about the hands that actually built the railroad itself. More importantly, it is because of this amazing infrastructure project, the Mountain Division of the Western North Carolina Railroad, that Western North Carolina is what it is today. That Asheville is what it is today. Bottom line, it would not have been possible without the human capital behind it. That human cost, that is the most important part. That's what needs to be remembered. That would not have been possible without the opening of these archival records and the research that the Rail Project Board has done so far. So for me, both as a historian and an archivist, what this comes down to is equity. So many of our libraries, our archives, our historical centers are white and male-centered still. As such, there's bias. There's archival silence in those spaces. As a historian, it's my job to locate, verify, share facts. As an archivist, it's my job to ensure that systemic biases in collection development, archival description, and access issues are addressed, including those archival silences. So this means continuing to do work like this, where diverse voices are uncovered, where they're shared, where all perspectives in the historical record are written about, and continuing to advocate for those who don't have a voice for whatever the reason. These people don't have a voice, they're gone. So just like these men who worked on the railroad, they left no personal record other than what we've managed to just start. I mean, we've just scratched the surface so far. Just start piecing together from these materials. We have to replace the biased narrative with the objective truth. As a historian, it is my responsibility to ensure that everyone has a voice and a seat at the table. We have to pass along a history to our children and our grandchildren that reflects everyone's stories and one that doesn't leave anybody's voice behind. So, on that final note, that was long. Thank you for listening to me get excited about this work. Thank you for making it to the end with me. Yes, that is my grandfather on the caboose of a Norfolk Southern train. That's around Clinchfield near Marion. That's the next county over. This is probably in the late 70s, early 80s, probably a few years before I was born. Feels like a long time ago, and I miss him every single day. So I am very happy if Dr. Judson would like to take any questions or comments that you have. Thank you again for spending your lunch hour with me today to listen to me motor on about all this.
This is not a question, it's a comment. I really appreciate the way that you kind of laid out the way the prison industrial complex has its roots in this 19th century black codes immediately following, or, previous Civil War era, that collusion between private industry and the legal system, one that we see even today. So I really appreciate that, highlighting that for us.
It's the facts. I mean, I'm doing what y'all taught me to do. Yeah.
Did this Western North Carolina Railroad project set a precedent for how you can use convict labor as a successful way of building these public works projects? Was this a defining role in, how do I?
You mean, is there a connection between the success of this project and public works projects today?
Yeah, and did it expand into other states that use it?
Oh gosh, yes, all across the South, yes. North Carolina was not the first state to use the convict labor system. It's used in Georgia. There's a letter on the Mosaic website from Kentucky's governor to Vance, asking him to send information to him about the convict lease system. He wants to start using it in Kentucky. This was a system that was replicated. I don't necessarily know that there is a link between the success of the Western North Carolina Railroad as a public works project and the success of public works projects today. I don't generally feel like there's a link there. But this system was used by more than just the state of North Carolina, and it was used before the state of North Carolina used it. Does that answer your question? Does that make sense? Okay. Anybody else? I knew you'd have a question.
I remember when Dan was giving his talk when he was before the inauguration.
He was supposed to be here today.
Yeah. I'll text him.
He had another talk at the same time. Don't be too hard on him.
So when he was researching the location of the cemeteries using dogs and I asked him, why don't you just dig and see if there are bodies or not, and open the graves? And he said this is not, the legislature will not allow it because there's a risk of cases with the preparation from the descendants of people who died there. And so it was a dead end in a way but here that's way worse than finding the bodies because you have records of every single person. And did the legislature consider this when they issued the law, or they had no clue what they were doing?
So John Ager slipped that provision into that omnibus bill, and there's a question there as to whether or not they even paid attention to what they were signing when they signed that opening up these records. My suspicion is that they didn't think like a historian would about what the repercussions would be from opening these records. I don't necessarily agree with your comment that it was a dead end when we brought in the dogs and the radar detection equipment, because the goal was to see if there were indeed mass graves. And one of the reasons that was done was because previously the number that they considered, the number of African Americans that they considered to have died on the railroad project was around 125, and the number that they considered to have worked on the railroad total was around 3,000. While I sat down there at the state archives, both of those numbers were quadrupled that. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay.
So to be clear, because maybe you already said this and I didn't catch it, but did you guys find like mass graves? Like I know that you said that people were buried in unmarked graves on site, like when they died, but was it like?
So the radar detection equipment that we brought in, we were only able to use at a couple of different places. And the dogs alerted, the several places that we were able to use the dogs, they alerted. most of that's on private property now. And there are a lot of folks down there who would not grant us permission to come onto their property because it is opening a whole can of worms if you go to do that. And going back to Dr. Trabulsi's question too, as far as like digging these bones up and everything, that a lot of those people who did not die went on back down east, married, had families. There are descendants today of those folks. Dr. Jeff Keith has actually contacted a couple of these families' descendants and talked to them. So there is the very real question of if you do this, are you disturbing a gravesite? You know, for what reason are you really digging it up for? I mean, this is a final resting place for them. The fact that we know that it's there now, and we know their contributions to Western North Carolina, that's a fitting enough memorial without having to dig them up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just was curious if that was like actually found, but I reckon that the numbers kind of imply it anyway, regardless.
Yeah, like I said, you know, previously it had been, they thought maybe about 125 had died overall. It's closer to 1,000 from what I found. Yeah, yes.
Were there any steps taken to cover up how prolific this was when it was introduced and implemented?
I'm sorry, repeat the second part of the question. Were there any steps taken to
cover this up, specifically while it was being implemented? Downplay the amount of convicts, downplay what was going on up there?
I don't necessarily think that it was covered up because you got to think about the time period it was in. That it just wasn't, you know, if it had been a white person who wasn't a convict working on it, it absolutely would have made the newspaper. There would have been an obituary. At this time, though, they were considered expendable. As far as to your question about cover up, thinking about it long term, as in today, that is purely a postulation, but I would say yes. I would say the reason that these records had not been opened was because the state legislature did not want them to be opened. Does that answer your question?
Perfect.
Yeah.
You spoke on some of the former enslaved people returning back east, but like I'm thinking about the people who had like longer sentences and the people who were sent from the penitentiary. Were they forced to do like more work, like physical labor, or were they returned to these penitentiary systems?
If they got sick, there were reports down there. Some of the women ended up pregnant. Some of the men ended up getting medical conditions from like secondary syphilis. Some of them were just worked really hard to where they couldn't work anymore. A lot of them got sent back down east, back to the state penitentiary system. Those who had long convict sentences usually stayed on the railroad until they just were broken down and couldn't anymore, and then they were sent back to the state penitentiary system. But sometimes, even after the Mountain Division was built, they came back and continued working on the railroad, because the railroad ended up going all the way to Murphy. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
Is the state penitentiary still like up and standing? Is it still, what's the condition of the penitentiary?
Yeah, it's the North Carolina State Prison System. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. I miss anybody? Yes.
The small percentage of convicts who were not African American, did you discover any obituaries on them?
Yes, we have, and I don't know if you noticed in the presentation, there were white men, some white women who worked on the railroad. It was few and far between, but yes, we did find some obituaries and mentions of white people who were working on the railroad. Let's see, the first gentleman right here is most likely Caucasian. Yes.
What were the role of the women?
Usually washers and cooks. Yep, they washed and they cooked. And they had to be very, very careful around overseers and guards. If you understand what I'm implicating there. Anybody else? Yep.
The women are convicts themselves or wives of a convict, so the whole family?
Convicts themselves. Usually your African American women are there for the same reason. They're trumped up charges. Yes.
I just have a question as to why the, if you know, why the archives were originally restricted. Was it just because it was something that reflected badly on the people, or is it just? I guess I don't understand why it would be restricted, but that's.
Prison records are generally restricted.
Okay.
Yeah, they're generally restricted for a certain number of years. These were not opened though, and my suspicion is that they were not opened because the state did not want anyone to see the misdeeds that happened with this. But generally, prison records are closed off by statute for so many years.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
I just wanted to say, if folks are interested in learning more about this, Scott Nelson wrote a book about John Henry called Steel Driving Man, where he kind of tracks the story of John Henry, who was a railroad worker in Virginia and experienced many of the things that you've discussed here. And so some of y'all might be too young to know what I'm talking about, the story of John Henry, the folk song and blues song, but some of you all may not be.
Douglas Blackman wrote Slavery by Another Name. That's a great book. I've used that a lot in reference with my current paper. Found a lot of information through his book.
Thanks for coming.